A teenager helped a taxi driver with a flat tire on a deserted road. He never imagined that this man would return the next day and change his life forever. Tyson Thompson was walking back from school, his backpack hanging loosely on one shoulder, shoes scraping the dirt road. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in faded pinks and oranges. His mind was cluttered with the usual worries. His mom struggling with bills, the workshop that barely made ends meet, and the school's notice about rising fees. He kicked a rock in frustration, watching it bounce off the roadside. He looked up, squinting at something ahead. It was a yellow taxi, stopped awkwardly on the side of the dirt road, slightly tilted. Tyson's eyes caught the old man, gray hair and bent shoulders, fumbling around the back of the car, looking a bit lost. Tyson slowed down, uncertain. The old man noticed him and waved, a bit desperate. Tyson's first thought was to ignore it. He had enough problems of his own. But there was something about the man's expression that made him stop, a mix of confusion and helplessness that Tyson couldn't brush off. "Hey, kid," the old man called out, his voice breaking the silence of the evening. "Got a flat tire here. You mind giving me a hand?" Tyson sighed internally. He walked closer, taking in the scene. The old guy had the spare out, but no jack in sight. The man was struggling to even figure out what went where. Tyson looked at the old tools scattered on the ground, rusted and practically useless. "Do you got a jack or something?" Tyson asked, his voice neutral. He didn't want to seem too interested, but he was already looking at the situation, his brain working through what needed to be done. "Yeah, somewhere. But it's all old, I think," the old man admitted. "Name's Jenkins. I ain't much of a mechanic. Truth is, I wasn't expecting a flat here." Tyson nodded, kneeling to examine the tools. They were a mess. He knew from just one look that they weren't going to do the job. He frowned, already feeling the weight of the decision ahead. He glanced down at his own clothes, his school uniform, the only decent set he had. If he got down and dirty now, that'd be it for these clothes. "Look, I think these tools ain't gonna help," Tyson said, standing up again. He could see the old man's shoulders slump a bit, his face dropping. Something about that look made Tyson's chest tighten. It wasn't like he had a lot of other options. This road was empty, and it wasn't like anyone else would come by anytime soon. Tyson made a quick decision. "I got some tools back home," he said, more to himself than to Mr. Jenkins. "I'll go grab them, just wait here." "Really?" Mr. Jenkins asked, a hopeful smile crossing his face. Tyson just nodded, turned, and began jogging towards home, feeling the dirt kick up under his feet. His house wasn't too far, but far enough that he felt his breath catch by the time he got to the garage. His Uncle Roy was leaning over the hood of an old car when Tyson burst in. Roy looked up, a bit startled. "What's got you in a hurry?" "Flat tire down the road," Tyson puffed, grabbing his small toolkit from the shelf. "An old guy needs some help." Roy raised an eyebrow. "And you're helping strangers now? You know we got enough trouble of our own, right?" Tyson didn't answer, just gave a quick nod and turned back out the door. He heard Roy mutter something under his breath but didn't pay attention. There was something about leaving that old man stranded out there. It didn't sit right with him. When Tyson got back to the taxi, Mr. Jenkins's face lit up. "Thought you weren't coming back," he said, relief flooding his voice. "I said I'd come back, didn't I?" Tyson replied, opening his toolkit. "Let's get this done." He set to work, jacking up the car, feeling the weight of it under his hands. Mr. Jenkins hovered nearby, trying to help, but mostly staying out of the way. Tyson could feel his uniform getting dirty, knees stained from the road, hands covered in grime. It bothered him, but there was no turning back now. "So, you go to school around here?" Mr. Jenkins asked, trying to make conversation. "Yeah," Tyson muttered, focused on loosening the lug nuts. "Local public school. Nothing special." You seem to know a lot about cars for a kid your age, Mr. Jenkins observed. My uncle's a mechanic, Tyson replied, shrugging. I help him sometimes, not like we got a lot else going on. The nuts finally came loose, and Tyson pulled the flat tire off, rolling it to the side. He glanced at the spare, frowning. It looked old, cracked, maybe dry-rotted. He glanced at Mr. Jenkins. This spare, you sure it's good? Mr. Jenkins scratched his head, looking unsure. It's what I got. I think it'll hold, right? Tyson didn't say anything, just nodded. He didn't have much of a choice. They had to make it work. He fit the spare in place, working as quickly as he could. The sun had dipped below the trees, and it was getting darker. He could feel the coolness of the night starting to settle in. Halfway through tightening the nuts, Tyson's phone started buzzing. He pulled it out and saw his mom's name flashing on the screen. He groaned. He knew she'd be worried. He silenced it, shoving it back in his pocket. He'd call her as soon as he finished. Trouble? Mr. Jenkins asked, seeing Tyson's expression. My mom. She's probably wondering why I'm late, Tyson admitted, his tone a bit annoyed. Mr. Jenkins nodded but didn't press further. Tyson worked in silence, finishing the job, tightening the last bolt and stepping back. He wiped his forehead, the sweat mixed with dirt making him feel even grimier. Done, he said, standing up and stretching his back. Mr. Jenkins looked genuinely relieved, a smile spreading across his face. Kid, you're a lifesaver, Mr. Jenkins said, clapping Tyson on the shoulder. You sure you don't want anything for your trouble? Tyson shook his head. I didn't do it for money. Just didn't want to leave you stuck. Well, at least let me give you a ride home, Mr. Jenkins offered, nodding towards the passenger door. It's getting dark. Tyson hesitated. He didn't know this guy, not really. But the road was empty, and home wasn't far. He looked at the man's face. He seemed genuine, tired, but thankful. All right, Tyson said after a pause. But no funny business, all right? Mr. Jenkins laughed. Promise, kid. Hop in. Tyson opened the door, sliding in. He could feel the old seat cover against his back, and the faint smell of old leather filled the car. Mr. Jenkins started the engine, and they began moving slowly down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the evening shadows. Tyson kept his eyes on the road, still unsure if he'd made the right call. But for now, he was along for the ride. The headlights cut a thin beam through the darkness as the taxi bumped along the dirt road. Tyson sat quietly, his hands resting tensely on his knees. Mr. Jenkins drove slowly, as if he was familiarizing himself with the vehicle all over again. The hum of the engine filled the awkward silence. Tyson kept glancing out the window, trying to gauge how far they were from his house. He felt the weight of his phone in his pocket, and the guilt nagged at him. His mom was probably frantic. So you live around here, right? Mr. Jenkins asked, breaking the silence. Tyson nodded without looking at him. Yeah, just down the road. It ain't far, he said, keeping his voice neutral. Mr. Jenkins glanced at him and nodded back. I appreciate your help, you know. Not a lot of folks would have stopped. Tyson shrugged. It's whatever. Didn't want to leave you out there. But you might want to get some better tools if you're planning to drive around much. Mr. Jenkins chuckled. You're not wrong, kid. Haven't had to change a tire myself in years. Guess I was due. Tyson offered a faint smile, but kept his guard up. He wasn't sure what to make of this guy. Taxi driver in a place like this didn't seem to add up. Most people had their own cars, and there wasn't a lot of demand out here. He shifted in his seat, eyes glued to the road ahead. As they neared the edge of Tyson Street, he could make out the flickering porch light of his small house. The familiar sight gave him a bit of comfort. One step closer to being home and putting all this behind him. You can just stop here, Tyson said, pointing to the corner. He didn't want Mr. Jenkins driving right up to the house and spooking his mom. Here? Mr. Jenkins asked, slowing the car down. "Yeah, it's fine. I'll walk the rest of the way." Tyson unbuckled his seatbelt, ready to get out. Mr. Jenkins nodded, then reached over the dashboard, opening the glove compartment. Tyson tensed, watching the man's hand carefully, but Mr. Jenkins just pulled out an old business card and handed it over. "Here. I know you said no to money, but if you need anything, you got dreams, kid. You look like the type who's got dreams." Tyson hesitated, then took the card. It was a bit faded, the edges worn. He didn't really read it, just stuffed it into his pocket. "Thanks, I guess. Take care of yourself, all right?" Mr. Jenkins said, giving Tyson a genuine look. "You're a good kid." Tyson nodded, muttering a quick, "Yeah, thanks," before getting out of the car and shutting the door behind him. He watched as Mr. Jenkins turned the taxi around, the headlights fading into the distance until there was nothing but the dim light of his own street. Tyson let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, turning and walking the rest of the way to the house. The dirt crunched beneath his shoes, and he could already see his mom's silhouette through the window. He knew she was waiting, probably pacing. He prepared himself for the questions and the scolding that was definitely coming. The front door creaked as Tyson opened it, stepping inside. His mom, Marie, was standing in the small living room, arms crossed, a worried look across her face. "Tyson, where the hell have you been?" she demanded, her voice a mix of fear and anger. "I called you a dozen times." Tyson sighed, dropping his backpack on the floor. I know. I was coming home, but there was this guy. His taxi broke down and he needed help." Marie's eyes softened just a bit, but she still looked frustrated. "You should have called me back. You can't just disappear like that, especially around here at this hour." Tyson rubbed the back of his neck, trying to ease the tension. "I know, I didn't want to leave the guy stranded. He was old. It didn't feel right." Marie sighed deeply, shaking her head, but she moved closer, pulling Tyson into a quick hug. "You've got a big heart, Tyson, but you need to be more careful, all right? This world isn't always kind, even when you are." "I know, Mom." "I'm sorry," Tyson said, hugging her back. She let go, patting his shoulder. "Go wash up, all right? Dinner's cold, but it's still on the stove." Tyson nodded, making his way to the small bathroom. He looked at himself in the mirror. His shirt was a mess, dirt smeared all over, his hands stained. He washed up quickly, scrubbing at the grime until his fingers looked clean again. He stared at the reflection for a second longer before heading to the kitchen. His Uncle Roy was sitting at the table, a plate in front of him. He glanced up as Tyson entered, his usual scowl in place. "So, you out there playing hero now?" Roy asked, his voice rough. There was a hint of sarcasm, but Tyson knew Roy wasn't actually mad. It was just his way. "Something like that," Tyson muttered, grabbing a plate and serving himself the leftover casserole. He sat down at the table, the old wood creaking beneath him. Roy took a sip of his drink, watching Tyson. "Just don't forget we got our own mess to deal with. You're not Superman, all right? Don't need you risking your neck for strangers." "I know, Uncle Roy," Tyson said, taking a bite. He was too tired to argue. He just wanted to eat and get to bed. "Yeah, well, good you helped the guy, I guess," Roy added, almost begrudgingly. "Not everyone's willing to stick their neck out. Just keep your wits about you." Marie came into the kitchen, joining them at the table. She glanced at Tyson's pocket, where he had stuffed the business card earlier. "What's that?" she asked, her eyes narrowing a bit. Tyson paused, then pulled it out, placing it on the table. He looked at it properly for the first time. The card read, "Jenkins Industries, Henry Jenkins, President." His mom picked it up, reading it, her eyebrows raising. "This guy, he's not just some taxi driver," she said, her voice filled with surprise. "He's got money. Why was he out there?" Tyson shrugged. "He didn't say much, just that he needed help and I helped. He gave me that before he left." Marie looked at the card, then at Tyson. Maybe this is something good, she said, her voice almost hopeful. But then she caught herself shaking her head. Don't get your hopes up, Tyson. People like that, they don't usually help folks like us. Tyson nodded. He didn't want to think too much about it. For him, it was just about not leaving someone stranded. That was all. But as he finished his dinner, he couldn't help but wonder why a guy like Mr. Jenkins was out there, pretending to be a taxi driver. And why did he seem so interested in Tyson? The night ended with Tyson heading to his small room, collapsing on the bed. He stared at the ceiling, the events of the day playing in his mind. The car, Mr. Jenkins, the strange feeling of being pulled into something bigger than himself. He had done what he thought was right, but somehow, it felt like this was just the beginning of something he couldn't quite see yet. The old business card sat on his bedside table, the letters, Jenkins Industries, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Tyson rolled over, closing his eyes. Whatever it was, he'd figure it out later. For now, all he needed was sleep. The morning came quicker than Tyson wanted. He was jolted awake by the muffled sounds of his mom in the kitchen, followed by his uncle arguing with someone on the phone. Tyson groaned, his eyes barely adjusting to the early sunlight filtering through the small window of his room. He blinked a few times, slowly pulling himself up and sitting on the edge of the bed. He noticed the business card from last night still sitting there, and for a moment, Tyson thought about tossing it into a drawer. It was just some weird memory from yesterday, but there was something about Mr. Jenkins that lingered. He picked up the card and slipped it into his backpack before heading to the kitchen. Marie was frying some eggs, her face weary but brightening at the sight of Tyson. She placed a plate down on the small table for him, her smile gentle. "Got school today, don't be late again," she reminded him, her tone a mixture of concern and practicality. "Yeah, Mom, I know," Tyson muttered, digging into the food. Roy entered the room still grumbling at whoever was on the other end of his call, his voice echoing as he finally snapped the phone shut and tossed it onto the counter. "Bill collectors?" Roy grunted, grabbing a cup of coffee. "Seems like they don't give a damn if you're breathing or not. Just want their money." Marie gave him a tired look, but didn't say anything. It was just another day in their world, scraping by, getting by somehow. Tyson ate quickly, focusing on the breakfast. As soon as he was done, he grabbed his backpack and slipped out the front door. The walk to school was long but familiar. Tyson kept his head down, the road beneath him shifting from dirt to cracked pavement as he neared the small old building that served as his high school. The place was run down, fences rusty, and the paint peeling on the outer walls. Tyson stepped into the courtyard, merging with the scattered groups of kids hanging around. "Hey, Ty!" a voice called out. Tyson looked up, spotting his friend Marcus walking over, a grin on his face. Marcus was short, always wearing an oversized hoodie, and had this energy that Tyson couldn't understand, but appreciated. "You were late yesterday, man. What's up?" Marcus asked, nudging Tyson's shoulder. Tyson shrugged, keeping his voice low. "Just, some guy needed help with his car. It was nothing." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "On that road? You're lucky it wasn't some crazy guy. You know how it is around here, right?" Tyson sighed. "Yeah, I know. But the guy was legit. He gave me this." Tyson pulled the business card out of his backpack and handed it to Marcus. Marcus squinted at it, his eyes widening a bit. "Jenkins Industries? Dude, I think I've heard of this guy. He's rich or something, right?" Tyson frowned. "I don't know. He said he wasn't really a taxi driver, just in disguise, I guess." "Rich folks are weird," Marcus said, handing the card back. "So what now? You think he's going to call you or something?" Tyson shrugged. "I don't know, man. I'm not expecting anything. Just felt different, you know?" Marcus nodded, though it was clear he didn't quite get it. "Well, good luck with that. But if he's rich, maybe he could hook you up, right?" Tyson chuckled, slipping the card back in his bag. Yeah, sure, let's not hold our breath. The bell rang, interrupting their conversation. Tyson trudged inside, falling into the routine. Teachers droning on, students half asleep. He tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to Mr. Jenkins, the weirdness of that whole encounter. It didn't help that, between classes, he'd get a couple more texts from his mom, making sure he was okay and reminding him to come straight home after school. By the time the last bell rang, Tyson felt drained. He was ready to head home, maybe see if he could help Roy in the garage. He was halfway across the schoolyard when a car horn made him jump slightly. He looked up, eyes widening. It was the yellow taxi. Mr. Jenkins was there, leaning out the driver's window, waving him over. Tyson looked around, noticing some kids glancing curiously at the scene. He frowned, adjusting his bag over his shoulder as he walked up to the car. "What are you doing here?" Tyson asked, keeping his voice low. Mr. Jenkins smiled. "I told you I'd be in touch. Thought I'd swing by and see how you were doing. Got a moment?" Tyson hesitated, glancing at the school gate. He really shouldn't be hanging around strangers, especially ones showing up at school. But curiosity got the better of him. "Yeah, all right," he said, opening the passenger door and getting in. "Relax, kid. I'm not kidnapping you," Mr. Jenkins said with a laugh, probably noticing the stiff way Tyson had sat down. "I just wanted to talk." Tyson didn't relax much, but he listened. The taxi pulled out of the school lot, moving slowly down the street. Tyson kept his eyes on the road ahead, ready to jump out if needed. "Listen, I know yesterday must have been weird," Mr. Jenkins started. "I wasn't honest with you. I wasn't just some guy with a flat tire. I was, well, kind of testing things out." Tyson frowned, glancing at him. "Testing what?" "People, I guess," Mr. Jenkins replied. "I wanted to see who'd stop and help without expecting anything in return. You did that, kid. You helped me, not knowing who I was, not expecting anything. That's rare these days." Tyson didn't know what to say to that, so he kept quiet. "Here's the deal," Mr. Jenkins continued. "I run a company. It's small, but it's something I built up over the years. And I've got some connections, especially when it comes to training young folks. I heard what you said about your uncle being a mechanic, and I want to help you get more out of that. You got potential, Tyson. You remind me of myself back when I had nothing." Tyson swallowed, his mind trying to catch up with everything being said. "I don't really know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything right now," Mr. Jenkins said, slowing the car as they approached Tyson's street. He reached into the glove compartment again, pulling out an envelope. He handed it to Tyson, who took it cautiously. "This is an application to a technical school. They do mechanics, welding, stuff like that. I'm willing to pay for you to go there. Full ride. It's not charity. It's because I believe in what you got. But it's your choice, kid." Tyson opened the envelope slightly, seeing the neatly folded papers inside. His heart pounded in his chest, and he felt a lump rise in his throat. This kind of thing didn't happen to people like him. Not here, not ever. I need to talk to my mom about this," Tyson finally managed to say. Mr. Jenkins nodded. "Of course, think it over. I know it's a lot, but the offer stands, all right?" Tyson nodded, unable to find more words. The car stopped in front of his house, and he slowly got out, holding the envelope like it was fragile. He shut the door, stepping back as Mr. Jenkins gave him a small wave before driving away. Tyson stood there for a moment, the late afternoon sun warming his skin. He could hear the distant clang of tools from the garage. He turned and walked up the driveway, heading straight for the garage where Roy was, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "Hey, Ty, what's up?" Roy asked, barely glancing up from under the hood. Tyson swallowed, holding up the envelope. "Uncle Roy, I think I might have gotten an offer. From that guy I helped yesterday." Roy looked up then, his eyebrows raised. "What kind of offer?" Tyson handed over the envelope, watching as Roy opened it, pulling out the papers and reading them over. His face shifted from skepticism to something almost like shock. "A tech school?" Roy asked, looking up at Tyson, his voice filled with disbelief. "This guy's serious?" Tyson nodded. "Yeah, I think he is. He said he'd pay for it, but I don't know, Uncle Roy. It feels too good to be true." Roy sighed, handing the papers back. He looked Tyson straight in the eyes, his voice softening. "Good things don't come easy around here, kid. But sometimes you just gotta take a leap." Tyson looked down at the papers, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. He heard his mom calling from inside, her voice worried. He knew this was just the start, that whatever came next was going to change everything. He walked towards the house, clutching the papers, knowing that this might be his one shot to make something of himself. Tyson was sitting on the worn-out couch in the living room, the envelope still in his lap. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, or maybe it was just in his head. His mom, Marie, was sitting across from him, her brow furrowed, fingers drumming against her knee. She had read the papers Mr. Jenkins had given Tyson twice already, and now she sat staring at them, lips pressed in a thin line. "Who is this man, Tyson?" Marie finally spoke, her voice full of caution. "People don't just do this kind of thing. What does he want in return?" Tyson shook his head. "He didn't say anything about wanting anything, Mom. He said he wanted to help. He said I remind him of himself when he was my age. I don't know, I think he's genuine." Marie sighed, leaning back against the couch. "People always have motives, Ty. Especially people with money." She picked up the business card from the table, squinting at it like it might tell her something more. "Jenkins Industries. I think I've heard of it, maybe on the news or something. But why was he out there pretending to be a taxi driver?" "I don't know," Tyson admitted, feeling the same question gnaw at him. "He said it was some kind of test, to see if people would help. I think he wanted to know if people would be kind without expecting something back." Marie looked at Tyson, her expression softening. She reached out, putting her hand on his. "You're a good kid, Tyson. You've got a good heart, and maybe that's what he saw. But I just don't want you getting hurt, okay?" Tyson nodded. He understood her fear. Their world wasn't one where good things happened often, and trust was a fragile thing. But there was something about Mr. Jenkins, his honesty, his genuine smile, that made Tyson want to believe. Marie exhaled, finally standing up. "Okay," she said, her voice resigned. "If this is real, if this is what you want, then we'll give it a shot. But I'm coming with you to meet this Mr. Jenkins properly. I need to know what kind of man he is." "All right, Mom. I'll talk to him," Tyson agreed, a small sense of relief washing over him. Later that day, Tyson sat in his room, staring at his phone. Mr. Jenkins had left a number on the card, and Tyson knew he needed to call. He took a deep breath, dialing the number and listening as the line rang. "Hello, Jenkins speaking," came the familiar voice, warm and polite. Hey, Mr. Jenkins, it's Tyson," he said, feeling a bit awkward. "You came by my school today." "Tyson, good to hear from you, kid. How are you doing?" Mr. Jenkins responded, his tone genuinely pleased. "I'm good. Listen, I talked to my mom about the offer you made," Tyson began, choosing his words carefully. "She wants to meet you, just to be sure." Of course, Mr. Jenkins said, his voice calm and understanding. "I'd expect nothing less. I'd be happy to come by and talk to her whenever she's free. How about tomorrow afternoon?" "Yeah, that works," Tyson said, glancing at the clock. "Thanks, Mr. Jenkins. I appreciate it." "You don't need to thank me, Tyson. I'm the one who appreciates you. I'll see you tomorrow," Mr. Jenkins replied before hanging up. The next afternoon, Tyson stood on the porch, watching the same yellow taxi approach from down the road. It pulled up slowly in front of the house, and Mr. Jenkins stepped out, dressed a little more formally this time, in a crisp shirt and dark trousers. He looked more like the businessman his card claimed him to be. Marie stepped out of the house, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of the man. Mr. Jenkins smiled politely, extending a hand. "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for letting me come by." Marie took his hand, her grip firm. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Jenkins. Please come inside." They all moved into the small living room, the air a little tense. Tyson sat on the edge of the couch while his mom took the armchair. Mr. Jenkins sat across from them, looking around at their modest home with a respectful nod. "Mr. Jenkins," Marie began, her voice cautious, "I want to understand why you're offering this to my son. You don't know us, and we certainly can't pay you back for something like this." Mr. Jenkins folded his hands, his expression sincere. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Thompson. You're right. People don't usually offer something like this without expecting anything in return. But honestly, I'm not here to take anything from Tyson or your family. I'm here because I saw something in him that reminded me of myself when I was young." He paused, glancing at Tyson, who listened intently. "I grew up not far from here, you know. Not with much to my name. I was raised by a single mom, just like Tyson here. And I learned that the world doesn't give out many chances to kids like us. But someone helped me, gave me a way out, and I promised myself that if I ever made it, I'd do the same for someone else." Marie looked at him, her eyes searching for any sign of dishonesty. "So this is you paying it forward?" Mr. Jenkins nodded. "Exactly. And I'm willing to make that bet on Tyson because of what I saw in him. He helped me, even when it wasn't convenient, even when it meant putting himself out there. That's the kind of integrity that can't be bought, Mrs. Thompson. It's rare, and I want to nurture it." Marie's gaze softened a bit, though the concern didn't fully leave her eyes. "And what happens after the school? Is this just a scholarship, or is there more?" Mr. Jenkins smiled. "The scholarship is the start, but I'd also like to offer Tyson an internship at one of my garages once he's learned the basics. It's real work, real experience, and if he's interested, it could turn into something long-term. No strings attached." Tyson felt his chest tighten, a mix of hope and fear coursing through him. This was real, it was actually happening. He looked at his mom, waiting for her response. Marie sat back, her expression thoughtful. After a long pause, she finally nodded. "Okay, Mr. Jenkins, if you're serious about this, then we'll take that chance. But I want you to know, Tyson means everything to me. I won't let anything hurt him." Mr. Jenkins smiled, his eyes meeting hers. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Mrs. Thompson, and I promise, this is about giving him a chance. Nothing more, nothing less." They spent the next hour going over the details, school requirements, the internship possibilities, and the logistics of getting Tyson to the technical school. The conversation flowed more easily after a while, and even Marie seemed to relax as Mr. Jenkins spoke more about his background and his intentions. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, Mr. Jenkins stood up, shaking Marie's hand again. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Thompson. Tyson, I'll see you soon, all right? Get ready for some hard work." Tyson grinned, his heart pounding in excitement. "I will, Mr. Jenkins, thank you." Mr. Jenkins gave him a nod and then headed for the door, the old taxi still parked outside. As he drove away, Tyson watched until the car disappeared down the road, a sense of disbelief still hovering over him. He turned back to his mom, who was standing by the door, her face soft but still cautious. "Tyson, this is a big deal," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm proud of you, but I need you to stay grounded, all right? Don't lose sight of who you are." Tyson nodded, stepping closer and giving her a hug. "I won't, Mom. I promise." Marie held him tightly, then let go, smiling at him. Now, go help your uncle in the garage. We've still got work to do around here." Tyson nodded, turning towards the garage. But there was a lightness in his step, something he hadn't felt in a long time. This was the beginning of something different, maybe even something good. The following morning, Tyson woke up feeling both excited and anxious. He stared at the ceiling for a few moments, trying to let it all sink in. Mr. Jenkins, the offer, the opportunity to learn at a technical school. He rubbed his eyes, realizing that a part of him was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to go wrong, as it always seemed to do. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that this was too good to be true. Marie had already left for her morning cleaning job, and Tyson could hear Roy in the garage, the sounds of metal clanking and tools hitting the concrete echoing through the small house. Tyson got dressed quickly, pulling on an old t-shirt and jeans, and headed out to join his uncle. Roy was hunched over a car, his hands greasy and his face pulled into a frown as he worked. Tyson stepped up next to him, grabbing a rag and wiping his hands. Roy glanced at him, grunting. "You ready to get to work, hero?" Roy asked, his voice gruff, but his eyes showing the tiniest hint of amusement. It was his way of saying he was proud. Tyson shrugged, smiling. "Yeah, always." Roy nodded, handing him a wrench. "Good. We got an old Chevy here that needs a lot of love. Let's see if you remember everything I taught you." Tyson got to work, the familiarity of the tools and the smell of motor oil helping calm the chaos in his head. He worked alongside Roy, both of them falling into their usual rhythm, Roy giving instructions and Tyson following them without question. For a while, everything felt normal, and Tyson could forget about the uncertainty that loomed over his future. But eventually, Roy stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked over at Tyson, his expression thoughtful. "So, this thing with Mr. Jenkins, you really think it's gonna happen?" Tyson paused, turning to look at his uncle. He saw the concern in Roy's eyes, the same concern he had seen in his mom. He understood it. They had been let down so many times before, and trusting someone like Mr. Jenkins wasn't easy. "I don't know, Uncle Roy," Tyson admitted, leaning against the car. "It feels real, but I'm scared, you know? Like, what if it's not?" Roy sighed, leaning next to him. "Kid, life's full of risks. You never know what's going to come of anything, but sometimes you got to take a chance. And maybe this is your chance." He looked at Tyson, his voice softening. "You're better at this than I ever was, Ty. You've got the potential to do more. Don't let fear hold you back." Tyson nodded, taking in his uncle's words. It was rare for Roy to speak like this. He was usually blunt, always keeping his emotions in check. Tyson felt a lump form in his throat, but he swallowed it down, giving his uncle a determined look. "Yeah, I'm gonna do it," Tyson said. "I'm gonna take that chance." Roy smiled slightly, giving Tyson a firm pat on the shoulder. "Good. Now let's get this damn Chevy running." They went back to work, but something in the air had shifted. Tyson could feel a newfound determination bubbling inside him, one that pushed the doubts aside, if only for a little while. After hours in the garage, Tyson finally washed up, scrubbing his hands until they were mostly free of grease. He grabbed his backpack, knowing he needed to head to the school's administrative office to fill out some forms Mr. Jenkins had mentioned. As he was getting ready to leave, Marie came in through the front door, her face flushed from working all morning. "Ty, you heading out?" she asked, glancing at his backpack. "Yeah, I've got to fill out some papers for the school," Tyson replied, slipping his backpack over his shoulder. "Mr. Jenkins said he'd take care of the rest, but they need my information." Marie nodded, her eyes softening. She walked over to Tyson, placing a hand on his arm. "Just be careful, okay? And make sure you ask questions. Don't sign anything you don't understand." "I will, Mom. Don't worry," Tyson assured her. He gave her a quick hug before heading out the door, his steps purposeful as he walked down the road. The school was quieter than usual when Tyson arrived, with most of the kids already in class. He made his way to the small administrative office at the back of the main building, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The secretary, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, looked up as he walked in. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone professional but indifferent. Yeah, I'm here to fill out some forms," Tyson said, feeling a bit out of place. "Mr. Jenkins, he's sponsoring me for a technical program, and they said I need to fill out paperwork here." The secretary's demeanor changed slightly at the mention of Mr. Jenkins, her eyebrows raising in recognition. "Oh, right. Mr. Jenkins called about you earlier," she said, reaching for a folder on her desk. "He's very insistent on getting everything set up quickly." Tyson nodded as she handed him a stack of papers. "You'll need to fill these out, and we'll need your mom's signature on a few of them as well. Mr. Jenkins is taking care of the rest. But this is your part." Tyson took the papers, sitting down at a small table in the office. He scanned through the forms, basic information, emergency contacts, permission slips. Nothing looked out of place, but he could feel the weight of it all pressing on him. He was signing up for something that could change everything, something that felt bigger than anything he had ever been part of before. As he filled in the blanks, his mind drifted back to the day before, to the way Mr. Jenkins had looked at him, like he believed in Tyson, like he saw something worth investing in. It was strange, that feeling. Tyson wasn't used to being noticed, wasn't used to people seeing potential in him. But Mr. Jenkins had, and now it was up to Tyson to prove he was worth it. He finished the paperwork, double-checking everything before standing up and handing it back to the secretary. She gave him a brief smile, taking the forms and placing them in the folder. "All right, you're all set, Tyson. Mr. Jenkins said he'd be in touch with you about the next steps." "Thanks," Tyson said, nodding as he turned to leave. Walking back home, Tyson felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. Hope, fear, excitement. It was all there, jumbled together in a way that made it hard to think straight. He knew that this was his shot, that if he wanted to make something of himself, this was the way to do it. But he also knew that nothing was guaranteed, that the world didn't owe him anything. When he got home, Marie was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked up as he walked in, her eyes filled with curiosity. "How did it go?" "Good," Tyson said, setting his backpack down. "I filled out the forms. They said Mr. Jenkins will be in touch." Marie nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. "I'm proud of you, Ty. This isn't easy, but you're doing it." Tyson smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Thanks, Mom." She stood up, walking over to him and placing her hand on his cheek. "Just remember, no matter what happens, you've already made me proud. You're strong, and you're brave, and you're going to do great things." Tyson nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'm going to try, Mom. I'm going to give it everything." "Good," Marie said, pulling him into a hug. She held him tightly for a moment before letting go, her eyes glistening. "Now go help your uncle again. I think he's got another car that needs your magic touch." Tyson laughed, nodding as he headed back out to the garage. The rest of the day passed quickly, with Tyson and Roy working side by side, the sound of tools and engines filling the air. For the first time in a long time, Tyson felt like he had a purpose, like he was moving towards something real. As the sun began to set, Tyson sat down on the garage steps, wiping sweat from his forehead. Roy joined him, cracking open a cold soda and handing one to Tyson. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. "You did good today, kid," Roy said, his voice quiet but sincere. Tyson looked over at him, a smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Uncle Roy." Roy nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "Just keep your head up, all right? You're going to face some tough days, but don't let them break you." "I won't," Tyson promised. And for the first time, as the night settled in around them, Tyson believed it. The next morning was typical. Tyson woke up early, stretching out the stiffness in his back from working in the garage the day before. The morning light seeped through the thin curtains, casting a dull glow around his small room. He could hear Marie moving around in the kitchen, the clinking of dishes and the low hum of the kettle heating up. Tyson got up, throwing on a clean shirt and jeans before stepping out to join her. "Morning, Mom," Tyson greeted, rubbing his eyes. Marie looked up from the stove, smiling warmly. "Morning, Ty. I made oatmeal and there's some bread, too." Tyson nodded, grabbing a bowl and spoon and settling down at the table. He could feel the weight of the day hanging over him. Part of him was still wondering what Mr. Jenkins' next move would be, and the other part was trying to just take things as they came. As he ate, the creak of the front door opening drew both his and Marie's attention. Roy came in, a newspaper tucked under his arm, and he gave a half wave before settling into the chair opposite Tyson. "Morning, folks. Looks like we might be getting some rain later today," he said, glancing out the window. Tyson nodded, barely paying attention to the weather forecast. His mind was busy sorting through the possibilities of what was about to happen in his life. He knew Mr. Jenkins wasn't like anyone they had dealt with before, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. Just as they were finishing breakfast, a car horn sounded from the front of the house. 2 short honks that made everyone look up. Tyson's heart skipped a beat, the sound familiar. He stood quickly, making his way to the window and peering out. There it was, the same yellow taxi, parked just beyond the dirt driveway. Mr. Jenkins was there, stepping out of the car, his figure a bit more imposing in the broad daylight. Tyson turned to look at Marie, who was watching him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "It's Mr. Jenkins," Tyson said, barely containing his own nervousness. "I think he's here to talk." Marie's eyebrows raised in surprise, and she exchanged a quick glance with Roy. "Go ahead, Ty. Let's see what he has to say," she finally said, her voice gentle. Tyson nodded, stepping out of the kitchen and making his way to the front door. He opened it just as Mr. Jenkins reached the porch, a friendly smile on his face. "Morning, Tyson," Mr. Jenkins greeted, waving. "Thought I'd stop by and check on you, see how things were going." Yeah, good morning, Mr. Jenkins," Tyson said, stepping back to let him in. "Mom and Uncle Roy are inside. We can talk in the living room." Mr. Jenkins nodded, stepping into the small house and giving a polite nod to Marie and Roy as he entered the living room. Marie stood, wiping her hands on her apron and offering her own small smile. "Mr. Jenkins, nice to see you again," she said. "Likewise, Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice warm. He turned to Roy, offering a handshake. "And you must be Tyson's uncle. It's a pleasure." Roy gave a nod, his handshake firm. "Yeah, nice to meet you. Thanks for stopping by." Tyson led Mr. Jenkins to the couch, where they all sat down, Tyson and his mom on one side, Roy standing behind them, and Mr. Jenkins across from them in the old armchair. There was a slight pause, a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. "So, Tyson," Mr. Jenkins began, folding his hands in his lap, "I wanted to come by because I got some news. I spoke to the technical school's administration, and it looks like we're all set. They're expecting you to start next week." Tyson's eyes widened, and he felt a mix of excitement and fear welling up inside him. "Next week?" he repeated, almost breathless. "That soon?" Mr. Jenkins nodded, his expression understanding. "I know it's fast, but I figured the sooner we get you started, the better. And I've got another bit of news, too. There's an opportunity for your Uncle Roy here, if he's interested." Roy, who had been standing with his arms crossed, shifted slightly, a hint of surprise crossing his face. "Opportunity?" he asked. Mr. Jenkins smiled. "I own a couple of auto repair shops in the area. They're always in need of reliable mechanics, and I was thinking, given your experience, you might be interested in coming to work for us. Steady pay, good benefits. It could be a good thing for the whole family. Roy blinked, clearly taken aback. He exchanged a glance with Marie, then looked back at Mr. Jenkins. You serious? I mean, I don't have any certificates or anything, just what I've learned over the years. Mr. Jenkins nodded. I know that, but I also know skill when I see it. And Tyson here told me about how you've been working on cars for years. You'd be more than qualified, Roy. The offer's there if you're interested. Roy stood in silence for a moment, his face unreadable. Tyson could tell that his uncle was struggling to process everything. This was something they had dreamed about for so long, but it was happening so suddenly. After a few long moments, Roy finally nodded. All right, Mr. Jenkins. I think I'd like that, he said, his voice a little rough. I appreciate the offer. It'd be good to have something steady. Mr. Jenkins smiled, standing up and offering his hand. Glad to hear it. We'll get everything sorted out this week then. I've already got the paperwork ready. Just need your signature, and we'll be good to go. Roy shook his hand, and Marie's eyes welled with tears as she watched the exchange. Tyson felt his own heart swell with a sense of pride, relief, and hope. This was it. Things were really starting to turn around for them. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, Marie said, her voice cracking just a little. You have no idea what this means for us. Mr. Jenkins gave her a kind smile. You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Thompson. It's Tyson who made all of this happen. His honesty and willingness to help. That's what brought us here. Tyson looked down, feeling his cheeks flush. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and having everyone look at him like that made him feel both proud and uncomfortable. Well, I should get going, Mr. Jenkins said, turning towards the door. I just wanted to share the news in person. Tyson, I'll be in touch with the details for next week. You're going to do great. Tyson stood up, following Mr. Jenkins to the door. Thanks again, Mr. Jenkins, for everything, he said sincerely. Mr. Jenkins patted Tyson on the shoulder, giving him an encouraging smile. Just keep working hard, Tyson. I'm excited to see where you'll go. With that, Mr. Jenkins headed out the door and back to the taxi. Tyson watched as the car disappeared down the road once again, a feeling of hope blooming inside him. He turned back to the living room, where his mom and uncle were both standing, smiles on their faces. Roy was the first to speak, his voice softer than Tyson had heard in a long time. Kid, you've done something real good here. You've given us a chance. Marie nodded, stepping closer and pulling Tyson into a hug. I'm so proud of you, Ty, she whispered. You're giving us a future. Tyson hugged her back, his eyes welling with tears. He had never imagined that helping a stranger on the side of the road would lead to this, a chance to make something of himself, a chance for his uncle to have steady work, a chance for his mom to finally breathe a little easier. When Marie finally let him go, she wiped her eyes and smiled. All right, now we've got to get ready. This is a big step, but we're going to make it. Together. Roy nodded, clapping Tyson on the back. Yeah, let's get to work, Ty. We've got cars to fix and we've got a lot of life ahead of us. Tyson smiled, feeling the weight of his family's love and hope pressing on him, but in a good way. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could see the path ahead, and it was a path worth taking. They all headed back to the garage together, the afternoon sun casting long shadows as they worked side by side, the smell of motor oil and the sound of tools echoing through the space. This was where Tyson belonged, and now he had a future that could take him even further. And for the first time, he believed that anything was possible. Tyson woke up the next Monday with a knot in his stomach, a mix of excitement and nerves. This was the day he would start at the technical school. His alarm buzzed loudly, and he quickly shut it off, pulling himself out of bed. He looked around his small room, same faded posters, same creaky dresser, but everything felt different now. Today was the start of something new. He dressed in his best shirt and jeans, smoothing down the fabric in front of the mirror. He took a deep breath, then grabbed his backpack and headed out of the room. In the kitchen, Marie was already waiting, a plate of scrambled eggs and toast on the table. She gave Tyson an encouraging smile as he walked in. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You ready for your big day?" Tyson nodded, sitting down at the table and picking at the eggs. His stomach was a bit too knotted to eat much, but he knew he needed something to get through the morning. He looked at his mom, noticing the way her eyes were a bit red around the edges, like she'd been crying earlier. "Mom, you okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. Marie smiled, nodding as she reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm just so proud of you, Ty. I never thought we'd get a chance like this, and I just want you to know. You deserve this. You deserve every bit of it." Tyson swallowed the lump in his throat, giving her a small smile. "Thanks, Mom. I'm going to do my best. I promise." After breakfast, Tyson grabbed his backpack, feeling the familiar weight of it on his shoulder. Marie walked with him out to the front yard, where Mr. Jenkins had promised to pick him up. Sure enough, just as they stepped outside, Tyson heard the rumble of the yellow taxi coming down the road. The car stopped in front of the house, and Mr. Jenkins stepped out, waving at Tyson and Marie. "Morning," he called out, his smile wide and genuine. "You ready for this, Tyson?" Tyson took a deep breath, then nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." Marie walked up to Mr. Jenkins, extending her hand. "Thank you again, Mr. Jenkins, for everything. I don't think we'll ever be able to repay you." Mr. Jenkins shook her hand, his expression kind. "You don't need to repay me, Mrs. Thompson. Tyson's got the potential, and I'm just helping him get where he deserves to be. He's got the drive. Now we just need to give him the tools." Marie smiled, her eyes welling up again. She turned to Tyson, pulling him into a tight hug. "Go on, Ty. Make me proud." Tyson hugged her back, then stepped away, opening the door to the taxi. He slid into the back seat, setting his backpack on the floor. Mr. Jenkins climbed in the driver's seat, giving Marie one last wave before driving off. The ride to the technical school was quiet at first. Tyson watched the scenery go by, the fields giving way to small houses, then more buildings, the town slowly coming to life as they drove. Mr. Jenkins glanced at Tyson in the rearview mirror, smiling slightly. "You nervous?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Yeah, a little," Tyson admitted. I don't know what to expect." Mr. Jenkins nodded. "That's normal, but I think you'll find your way just fine. From what I've seen, you're a quick learner, and you've got the determination. That's all you need." Tyson looked at Mr. Jenkins, seeing the belief in his eyes. It made something inside Tyson settle, the nerves fading just a little. He nodded. "Thanks, Mr. Jenkins. I'll give it my all." They pulled into the parking lot of the technical school, the building much bigger than Tyson had expected. It wasn't like his high school. The walls were clean. The cars parked outside were lined up neatly, and there was an energy about the place that felt different. People here wanted to learn. They were here because they wanted to be, not because they had to. Mr. Jenkins parked the taxi, turning to Tyson. "All right, kid. Let's go get you settled." They both stepped out of the car, and Tyson took a deep breath, adjusting the strap of his backpack. They walked towards the entrance, Mr. Jenkins leading the way. Inside, the receptionist greeted them with a smile, and Tyson could already see students moving through the halls, some in jumpsuits, others carrying tools. "This is it," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice filled with a mix of pride and encouragement. "You're going to learn a lot here, Tyson. And remember, this is just the beginning." They met with one of the instructors, a man named Mr. Patterson, who shook Tyson's hand firmly. He was a tall, broad-shouldered guy with a kind face, and his handshake was strong. He smiled at Tyson, his eyes crinkling. "Tyson, right? I heard about you from Mr. Jenkins here," Mr. Patterson said. "Welcome to our little family, We're excited to have you on board." "Thank you, sir," Tyson said, feeling a bit overwhelmed but also excited. Mr. Patterson led them on a quick tour of the school, showing Tyson the different workshops, the classrooms, and finally the main garage, where students were already working on various cars. The air smelled like motor oil, and the sound of drills and metal clinking filled the space. Tyson could feel his heart racing a bit. This was it. This was where he belonged. "You'll be starting here today," Mr. Patterson said, pointing towards a car that was raised on a lift. "We'll go over the basics first, make sure you know your way around, then we'll get you working on some hands-on projects. Think you're up for it?" Tyson nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, I'm ready." Mr. Jenkins clapped Tyson on the shoulder, his smile wide. "That's what I like to hear. I'll leave you to it then. I'll check in on you later, all right?" Tyson turned to Mr. Jenkins, his expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. I wouldn't be here without you." Mr. Jenkins shook his head. "You earned this, Tyson. Remember that." He gave Tyson one last encouraging nod before turning and heading back out. Mr. Patterson led Tyson over to where a few other students were gathered. They were all wearing similar jumpsuits, and Tyson suddenly felt out of place in his regular clothes. Mr. Patterson noticed, smiling. "We'll get you a jumpsuit and a set of tools today," he said. "But for now, let's just get you started." Tyson nodded, watching as Mr. Patterson introduced him to the group. There were 2 other guys and a girl. All of them looked to be around Tyson's age, maybe a year or 2 older. They all gave him polite nods, though one of the guys, Eric, gave him a long, appraising look. "So you're the new guy, huh?" Eric asked, his tone not unfriendly but not exactly welcoming either. "Yeah," Tyson replied, standing a little straighter. "Name's Tyson." Eric nodded. "Well, we'll see if you can keep up. Patterson runs a tight ship." Tyson grinned, feeling a spark of determination. "I can handle it." The rest of the day was a whirlwind. Tyson was shown the tools, given a rundown of safety procedures, and finally handed his own jumpsuit, the fabric stiff and new. He changed quickly, pulling the jumpsuit on and zipping it up, feeling a strange sense of pride at the sight of himself in the mirror. Mr. Patterson paired him up with Eric for the first task, checking the brakes on one of the older cars in the garage. Eric led Tyson over, explaining the steps, and Tyson listened carefully, nodding along. They worked in silence for a while, Tyson mimicking Eric's movements, the 2 of them focused on the task at hand. "Not bad for your first day," Eric finally said, a hint of a smile on his lips as they finished up. "You're a quick learner." "Thanks," Tyson said, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked around the garage, the other students all busy with their own projects, the air filled with the hum of activity. For the first time in a long time, Tyson felt like he was part of something bigger, something that mattered. By the end of the day, Tyson was exhausted, but in a good way. His hands were sore from gripping tools, his legs ached from standing all day, but there was a sense of satisfaction that made it all worth it. He changed out of the jumpsuit, tucking it into his bag to take home, then made his way to the front of the building where Mr. Jenkins was waiting in the taxi. "How was it?" Mr. Jenkins asked as Tyson climbed in, his voice genuinely curious. "It was great," Tyson said, his face breaking into a grin. "It was hard work, but I loved it." Mr. Jenkins nodded, smiling as he started the car. "I knew you would. Just keep that same attitude, kid. Hard work pays off." Tyson looked out the window as they drove away from the school, the sun setting low on the horizon. This was only the beginning, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He was ready to take on whatever came next. Tyson had settled into his new routine over the next few days, but nothing about it was easy. The technical school was demanding, more so than he'd expected, and the environment was different from what he was used to. Here, everyone wanted to be the best, and they pushed each other to prove it. There was no room for slackers, and Tyson knew he had to prove that he belonged there, especially to people like Eric, who seemed to be watching him closely. On Thursday, Tyson walked into the workshop to find Mr. Patterson waiting with a clipboard. The students were gathered around, and Tyson felt the tension as soon as he stepped in. Mr. Patterson's voice boomed across the workshop as he called everyone over. "All right, everyone, today's a big day. We're going to have a practical skills test," Mr. Patterson announced, his eyes scanning the group. "This is to see where everyone stands, what you've learned, and how you apply it. Don't worry, it's not graded, but it will determine who gets to work on the advanced projects." Tyson could feel his heart rate picking up. A test. Already? He had only been here a few days, and although he'd learned a lot, he still felt like a beginner compared to the others who had been here for weeks, even months. Eric, standing nearby, shot Tyson a glance, a faint smirk on his lips. "You ready for this, new guy?" Eric asked, his voice low enough that only Tyson could hear. Tyson took a breath, nodding. "Yeah, I think so." Eric's smirk widened. "We'll see. Just don't freeze up when the pressure's on." Tyson clenched his jaw, feeling the challenge in Eric's words. He couldn't afford to mess this up, not with everything on the line. He'd fought too hard to get here, and he wasn't going to let anyone think he didn't deserve his place. Mr. Patterson began explaining the test. It would involve diagnosing an issue with one of the vehicles and fixing it under a time limit. Each student would be assigned a car with a different problem, and they'd be judged on both speed and accuracy. Tyson listened carefully, his stomach in knots, but he nodded along, trying to absorb every word. "All right, everyone, let's get started. Tyson, you're up first," Mr. Patterson said, pointing to a red sedan that was parked on one side of the workshop. Tyson felt his legs move automatically, carrying him over to the car. He could feel the eyes of the other students on him, especially Eric's, and he tried to block it out, focusing instead on the task at hand. Mr. Patterson handed him the clipboard, giving him a nod. "Take your time, but remember, you're being evaluated on efficiency too. Let's see what you've got," Mr. Patterson said. Tyson took a deep breath, then opened the hood of the car, staring down at the engine. He began his inspection, his fingers tracing wires and hoses, his mind running through the possibilities. The problem could be electrical, maybe something with the ignition system, or it could be a simple mechanical issue. He could hear the murmurs of the other students behind him, and he knew they were waiting for him to slip up. He found the issue, a loose connection on the ignition coil. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly grabbed his tools, tightening the connection and checking the wiring. He reassembled the parts, his hands moving swiftly, and then stepped back, looking over at Mr. Patterson. "All right, let's give it a try," Mr. Patterson said, nodding towards the driver's seat. Tyson walked around, sliding into the seat and turning the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered for a moment, then roared to life. Tyson felt a wave of relief wash over him, and he looked up to see Mr. Patterson nodding, a hint of a smile on his face. "Good work, Tyson. Quick diagnosis. Clean execution," Mr. Patterson said, jotting something down on the clipboard. Tyson stepped out of the car, feeling a smile tug at his lips. He looked over at Eric, who was watching with his arms crossed. Eric raised an eyebrow, then gave a slight nod, almost as if to say, "Not bad." The rest of the day went by in a blur. More tasks, more practice, and more challenges. Tyson worked alongside the others, gradually feeling the gap between him and the more experienced students start to close. He listened to Mr. Patterson's instructions, asked questions when he didn't understand, and tried to absorb every detail he could. Slowly, he could feel himself growing more confident, more comfortable. During lunch, Tyson sat at one of the tables in the workshop, eating the sandwich his mom had packed. Eric walked over, sitting down across from him without asking. He opened his own lunch, taking a bite of his sandwich before glancing at Tyson. "You did all right today," Eric said, his tone grudging. Didn't think you'd get it running." Tyson looked up, shrugging. "Thanks. I've worked on cars before, just not like this." Eric nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "Yeah, well, this place isn't easy. Most people who come here don't last long. It's a lot of pressure, and Patterson doesn't go easy on anyone." Tyson nodded, taking a sip from his water bottle. "I know, but I'm not planning on quitting. I've got too much riding on this." Eric studied him for a moment, then nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Good. Just don't expect anyone to hold your hand around here. You gotta prove you belong every day." Tyson smiled slightly. "I plan to." After lunch, they went back to the garage for the next round of tasks. This time, they were paired up. Tyson found himself working with a girl named Kayla, who had been at the school for a few months already. She was quiet, but efficient, her movements quick and precise as they worked on an old pickup that needed a brake job. "Pass me that wrench?" Kayla asked, glancing over at Tyson. Tyson handed her the wrench, watching as she worked. She barely spoke, but Tyson could see how focused she was. Her eyes narrowed as she tightened the bolts. He tried to follow her lead, mimicking her precision, and gradually they started to fall into a rhythm. By the time the day ended, Tyson felt exhausted, his muscles aching and his mind foggy from all the information he had absorbed. But there was a sense of satisfaction that came with it. He had faced the challenges, taken the tests, and come out the other side stronger. Mr. Jenkins was waiting for him again when the day ended, the yellow taxi parked outside the building. Tyson climbed in, letting out a deep breath as he leaned back in the seat. Mr. Jenkins glanced at him, his eyes twinkling. "Rough day?" Mr. Jenkins asked. Tyson nodded, a tired smile on his face. "Yeah, they're not messing around here." Mr. Jenkins laughed. "That's how you learn, kid. They push you so you grow, and from what I hear, you're doing just fine." Tyson looked over at him, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "You talked to Mr. Patterson?" "Of course," Mr. Jenkins said. "He said you've got potential, and you're putting in the work. That's what matters." Tyson felt a warmth spread through him, a mix of pride and relief. He had worried that he wouldn't be able to keep up, that he would fall behind the others. But hearing that he was doing well from Mr. Jenkins, it made everything worth it. As they drove home, Tyson looked out the window, the town passing by in a blur. He thought about everything that had happened, about the flat tire, about Mr. Jenkins, about the technical school. He thought about his mom and Roy, and about the hope that had returned to their home. And for the first time, he felt like he was truly on his way to something better. When they arrived at Tyson's house, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over everything. Tyson stepped out of the car, grabbing his bag from the back seat. Mr. Jenkins leaned out of the driver's window, giving him an encouraging nod. "Get some rest, Tyson. Tomorrow's another big day," Mr. Jenkins said. Tyson nodded, smiling. "I will. Thanks, Mr. Jenkins. I appreciate everything." Mr. Jenkins waved as he pulled away, the taxi disappearing down the road. Tyson stood there for a moment, watching until the car was out of sight. Then he turned and walked up the steps, opening the front door to the smell of dinner cooking. Marie was in the kitchen, and Roy was sitting at the table, a newspaper spread out in front of him. Tyson dropped his bag by the door, heading over to the kitchen. "Hey, Mom," Tyson said, giving her a tired smile. Marie turned, her face lighting up. "Hey, sweetheart. How was school today?" Tyson leaned against the counter, thinking for a moment. "It was tough, but it was good. I think I'm getting the hang of it." Marie smiled, her eyes glistening with pride. "I knew you would. I'm so proud of you, Ty." Roy looked up from his newspaper, giving Tyson a nod. "Kid's got skills. I always said that. You keep at it, Ty." Tyson nodded, feeling a swell of determination. "I will, Uncle Roy. I'm not giving up." As they sat down to dinner, The three of them talked about their day, the conversation easy and warm. And as Tyson looked around at his family, his mom's tired but hopeful smile, Roy's gruff but caring nod, he knew that he was doing this for them, for all of them, and he wasn't going to stop until he made something of himself. The sun was barely up when Tyson woke the next morning. The light crept through the thin curtains, illuminating the edges of his small room. Today felt different. It was the end of his first week at the technical school, and it was a day Tyson had promised himself he'd face with all the grit he could muster. The routine was starting to feel real, like a part of his life now. He got dressed, pulling on his jumpsuit, and looked at himself in the mirror. The fabric was already worn in spots from the work, and it made him smile. This was who he was becoming, someone who worked hard, who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. He headed to the kitchen where Marie was already up, making coffee. She turned, smiling as she saw Tyson. Her eyes held both pride and concern, like they always did. "Morning, Ty. You ready for your last day of the week?" "Yeah, Mom," Tyson said, rubbing his eyes. "It's been a lot, but I'm getting the hang of it." She nodded, setting a plate with some toast and scrambled eggs in front of him. "That's good, I can tell. You look different, more confident maybe." Tyson smiled. "I guess I feel it too. I mean, there's still so much I need to learn, but it's starting to click." Roy shuffled into the kitchen, still in his old work shirt, and nodded at Tyson. "Kid, you're doing good. I heard from Jenkins that they're happy with your work so far." Tyson looked up, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "You talked to Mr. Jenkins?" "Yeah, he swung by the shop yesterday," Roy said, grabbing a cup of coffee. "He said you're making a name for yourself. Keep that up, and you'll be doing more than just fixing cars soon." Tyson felt his chest swell with pride. He finished his breakfast quickly, saying goodbye to Marie and Roy before heading out the door. The taxi wasn't there today. Mr. Jenkins had called last night to tell Tyson he'd arranged for him to take the bus, wanting Tyson to start being more independent in getting to the school. Tyson understood. This was a part of growing up, part of the change. He boarded the bus, feeling the vibrations of the engine under his feet as it rumbled down the road. Tyson watched the town roll by through the window, thinking about how much his life had changed in just a few days. It was strange to think that only a week ago he was still walking home from school, his dreams feeling so far away. Now everything was starting to feel real, like he could almost reach out and grab it. When Tyson arrived at the technical school, he made his way into the workshop, setting his bag down and pulling on his gloves. The place was already buzzing with activity, students moving around, tools clinking, and the hum of engines filling the air. Tyson found Eric and Kayla at their usual spot, the two of them going over a list of tasks for the day. "Hey, Ty," Kayla called, her voice warm. "We're going to be working on something new today. Patterson wants us to handle an engine rebuild. You up for it?" Tyson's eyes widened, excitement flooding through him. An engine rebuild? That was advanced work, something that would challenge every bit of skill he'd learned so far. He looked at Eric, who gave him a nod. "It's a big job," Eric said, his tone less guarded than before. "But you've been keeping up, so let's see if you can handle it." Tyson grinned, pulling on his gloves more securely. "Let's do it." They got to work, the three of them around the car that had been assigned to them. A mid-2000s sedan with a worn-out engine that needed more than just a tune-up. Mr. Patterson hovered nearby, watching as they organized their tools and went over the steps. "Remember, teamwork is key," Mr. Patterson said, nodding at them. "This is a big job, but I know you've got it in you." Tyson nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility. They started by disassembling the engine, working carefully to label each part, to organize everything so they wouldn't be left guessing when it was time to put it all back together. Kayla took the lead, explaining each step to Tyson as they went along, her voice calm and sure. "Here's where it gets tricky," she said, pointing to one of the components. This gasket here, it's pretty fragile. We need to remove it without damaging it, or we'll have to replace it, which means more time and money. Tyson nodded, his eyes following her hands as she carefully removed the part. He felt Eric watching him, evaluating his every move, but it wasn't the same as before. There was less judgment now, more a sense of camaraderie. Tyson knew he was earning their respect, slowly but surely. Hours passed as they worked, and Tyson found himself getting lost in the rhythm of it, the clink of metal, the smell of motor oil, the way the pieces all fit together like a puzzle. He loved it. This was where he belonged. "Hey, Ty, take over here," Eric said, stepping back to let Tyson have a go at one of the more intricate parts of the rebuild. Tyson took a deep breath, stepping up and taking the wrench from Eric's hand. He worked carefully, his eyes focused, his hands steady. "Not bad," Kayla said after a while, giving Tyson a nod. "You're getting the hang of it." Tyson smiled, feeling a surge of pride. It was the kind of validation he hadn't realized he needed until that moment. By the time they finished, the day was nearly over. The engine was reassembled, and Mr. Patterson came over to inspect their work, his eyes moving carefully over each part. He nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Excellent work," Mr. Patterson said, his voice full of approval. "You all did well today. Tyson, especially. You've come a long way in just a week. Keep this up, and you'll be handling these rebuilds on your own soon enough." Tyson felt his face break into a wide grin, his chest swelling with pride. He looked at Eric and Kayla, both of them giving him nods of approval. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged here, that he was part of something, part of a team that trusted him. After the final cleanup, Tyson changed out of his jumpsuit, putting it into his bag and heading for the bus stop. The ride home was quiet, and Tyson leaned his head against the window, watching as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the town beginning to fade into the evening shadows. He thought about everything, about how far he'd come in just a week, about the challenges he'd faced and the way he'd pushed through. When he got home, Marie was waiting for him on the porch, her eyes lighting up as she saw him step off the bus. She stood, walking over to meet him, her hands resting on his shoulders as she looked at him. "How was your day, Ty?" she asked, her voice gentle. Tyson smiled, his heart full. "It was amazing, Mom. We rebuilt an engine today. Patterson said I did well. He said I've come a long way." Marie's eyes glistened with tears, and she pulled Tyson into a hug, her voice trembling. "I'm so proud of you, Ty. You're doing it. You're really doing it." Tyson hugged her back, his eyes closing as he let himself feel the warmth of her embrace. This was why he was doing it. For her, for Roy, for the family that had given him everything they could. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be more challenges, more moments of doubt. But he also knew that he had the strength to face them. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to stop now. They walked inside together, the smell of dinner wafting through the house. Roy was at the table, looking up as Tyson entered, a rare smile spreading across his face. "Kid, Jenkins called me earlier," Roy said, his voice gruff but warm. "He said you're a natural, said you've got a real future ahead of you." Tyson felt his heart swell, and he nodded, his voice thick. "Thanks, Uncle Roy, I'm just doing my best." Roy nodded, raising his glass in a toast. "Well, keep at it. You've got something special, Ty. Don't let anyone take that from you." They sat down to dinner, the three of them together, laughter and warmth filling the small kitchen. Tyson looked at his family, his mom's bright smile, Roy's proud nod, and he knew that this was only the beginning. The path ahead was still long, still uncertain, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had found his place and he was ready for whatever came next.